Hi there. Welcome again to this video about Leanna Fuller's book, When Christ's Body is Broken. And yesterday we talked about the first part, what's the problem? And number two, what do churches fight about? We also talked about why is difference so threatening, number three. Today we're going to be talking about number four, why do group identities matter? Number five, where is God in all this? And number six, what can conflicted congregations do? And I was just thinking about the speech I heard by Obama a few minutes ago at the eulogy for John Lewis's funeral, where he said we must, instead of turning on each other, turn towards each other. And so I think of this book as an excellent example of that dynamic of turning towards one another instead of turning on one another. So last time we talked about why, what are some of the psychological dynamics at work, and what anxiety means in church conflict. Now we're going to talk a little bit about some of the sociological dynamics. And if you recall, Fuller is talking about two different churches here. One church is a UCC church that's experienced serious conflict, kind of split over the denominations, choices about LGBTQ ordination, and the second church is a Methodist church who's had some conflict about worship services. That's kind of arisen from within the congregation's own needs and process. So in this chapter, she's going to be talking about, this is chapter 4, Why Do Group Identities Matter? Fuller introduces us to some of the sociological theories about conflict, what she calls contending. So contending behaviors usually are caused by fear and involvement of social identities, and she describes she compares the light contending versus heavy contending. So light contending is promises, persuasive argumentation. Heavy contending usually includes threats. If you don't change your choices, I'll leave. So a threat about breaking relationship. And in the UCC church, I think she experienced some of the heavy contending. Another version of the remaining side at this UCC conflict was kind of a magical prediction. The other will get hurt if it fails to act in a particular way. So that's another version of a threat. So there was also this discussion of how the minister became the pawn in the threat game for the different parts of the congregation. Escalation in a conflict is when people move from lighter to heavier threats over time. Escalation happens in ways that are increasingly difficult to undo, and they go from specific to general issues, Fuller says. So this is a typical escalation progression, from wanting to do well, to wanting to win, to wanting to hurt the other. And this can happen kind of unconsciously, or it doesn't seem to be within any single individual's control, this process of escalating. And there were a few people who tried to enlist a lot of individuals on their side of the conflict. One equation that Fuller presents is, to what extent is self-concern higher than other concern in the conflict? Or to what extent is other concern approach self-concern in a conflict? And that might impact how the escalation plays out. Interpersonal bonds seem to lead to other concern, but occasionally it becomes antagonistic and contentious in the process. One person said, this is how closely the denominational identity was linked. If we stop being UCC, we will be nothing. That's on page 127. So Fuller says that high levels of anxiety and perceived threats make conflicts escalate. And you can tell they're escalating when there's kind of an increase in zero-sum thinking and negative framing. At the worship church, the UMC church, negative emails were a part of the conflict, and they were devastating to those who received them. This is something new about kind of internet communication. It can be kind of undisciplined, and it can have people at their worst trying to interact with one another at all times of the day. The church hired an outside consultant in a problem-solving joint effort, and this person was able to help people talk to one another and exchange information. Everybody had a chance to listen to without each other without being interrupted, and this was kind of a bridging activity. Bridging, she says, in bridging, neither party achieves its initial demands, but a new option is devised that satisfies the most important interests underlying these demands. That's on page 131. And sometimes there were special subgroups like a Sunday school class that would help people to stay together. So the problem at the conflict at the worship church actually led to greater closeness over time. And at the UCC church that was conflicted over the denominational ruling, there were a lot more interconnections through blood or marriage. So the opposite of zero-sum thinking is positive-sum thinking, the view that the two parties' interests are not totally opposed and that problem-solving is feasible. So those are some of the dynamics sociologically when you look at what's happening in groups. And there's a lot of new terminology in there too. Well, I asked yesterday if fighting in church is a theological act. And I want to follow up with that by moving now to Fuller's 5th chapter, Where is God in All This? And in this chapter, she does, I think, one of the richer looks at church conflict from a theological view as possible. And she says that we actually need our differences. So difference is both a challenge and a gift, she says. Resistance to difference is the fundamental way that people operate. But it can also be seen as part of God's, or as a response to God's enlivening power. And for this, that was on page 139, that quote. For this, she turns to a kind of notion of what the church is based on vulnerability. And there's an element of what's tragic here. She turns to theologian Ed Varley to help her explain this. Something about our vulnerability makes us likely to hurt one another and become alienated from one another. The tragic is in the foreground here, and then the sin is in the background. And there's a suffering that occurs when people themselves are wounded. So our complex, ambiguous selves that we bring to conflict are neither all good nor all bad. And this is important to remember when the infighting begins. But most of all, Fuller says in this chapter, conflict is a foreseeable consequence of living in relationship to one another. And there's this theological term, the interhuman, the place where we relate to one another is the place where we experience conflict with one another. And this is all both pastoral, theological, and relational. So she says the acknowledgement of difference requires us acknowledging our inability to know what's in the other's mind and their basic autonomy in the face of our own. That's on page 144 and 145. That may be one of the most important sentences from the book. Acknowledgement of difference requires us acknowledging our inability to know what's in the other's mind and their basic autonomy in the face of our own. So that's really where empathy enters, right? Is that place of not knowing. Fuller says that people are profoundly broken and participating in healing at any given moment. And that diversity is a good created by God and a desirable norm for faith communities. She talks about in these congregations, it seems as difficult for people to accept differences within their own congregations as it might be for them to talk to someone from another religion entirely. So paradoxically, talking with someone from another faith might be simpler than talking with someone from your own faith with whom you find yourself alienated or isolated. And she just says there's very little theological research on the pluralism within congregations. And she noted that people don't seem to don't seem to expect to find much diversity within their own traditions. And there's also a move towards kind of a argument for theological unity, where people who raise complaints should just let it go and kind of go with the group. But Fuller says that theological diversity is in fact a norm and a good. And so we have to think about people. She turns to Salcino's work on being about borders, encourage people to think about hybrid existence. We have many different stories in our communities, many different identities. And there was this question, is the difference between an educational background between a church leader and their congregation going to tend to lead to diminishing differences between them or heightening differences between them? So churches have always included a diversity of outlooks, and so discernment. She goes to this term of discernment. Discernment is about members of a faith community working together to assess whether previous theological commitments still seem to reflect the will of God and faithfulness to the church's mission. That quote is on page 156. So is the role of theological reflection agreement or consideration of what's ultimately important or valuable? And in order to really grapple with this dynamic, you have to get to the visceral reaction that so often arises with the idea of difference. And to this, she turns towards vulnerability, which includes the ability to be harmed as well as the ability to be fully known. So what is the problem? Her title of this book is When Christ's Body is Broken. What's the problem in church conflict? Is it the fact of conflict being in a church? Or is it the attempt to eliminate the difference that still persists within a church and kind of eliminate conflict, kind of by fiat? She thinks what really breaks the church is not conflict, but the attempt to eliminate difference. Hospitality is a posture of relationship, quote, that recognizes the basic human dignity of others and embraces apparent differences, end quote, on page 161. So she turns to the notion of from family systems called differentiation. Differentiation is when you define yourself, but you stay in relationship, stay in touch. So in hospitality and vulnerability, you're both the guests, you're both in the quest for truth, and you're celebrating diversity at the same time. So this requires learning how one's own certainties can be challenged by another's presence. Hospitality means acknowledging that one's deeply held feelings will be questioned. Remembering our strangeness before God is a crucial part of this posture. Congregational conflicts around sexuality are more identity-based, she says, than something like a divorce dispute or disagreement. So there's something about your being that's at stake when you're with people on religious matters or matters of faith. It's an identity-based discussion, not just an interest-based discussion. So that's a crucial step towards acknowledging the anxiety that these conversations produce. The pastors, I think, in this UCC church felt unprepared when the denomination changed. So conversations about where do people differ when a denomination leads in a different direction. And then feeling unseen in your community can be extraordinarily painful for church members, Fuller finds. Having a small group component to conflict and functional subgrouping is what it's called. And this kind of response is when people on the outside start to listen for people on the inside. So here we're into chapter 6. What can conflicted congregations do? So Fuller is going to turn us towards some solutions here. And she references the work of groups like the Turner Center for Church Leadership and the Center for Congregational Health. And she talks about getting experts in, getting conflict mediators in. And the pastors in the UCC church, for example, couldn't remain neutral on the topic, and so they couldn't lead in the conflict. And those conflict mediators, both of these churches, I think, kind of wish they would have had conflict experts come in a little bit sooner than they did. because just talking about the problem can kind of tend to exacerbate the problem. So in the listening sessions, people on the outside of the subgroup talked. This is Azarian's model of functional subgrouping, which she uses in conflict resolution. People on the outside group talk to without interruption, and then other people get to listen. And so there's a chance for conversation to happen without going to kind of winners or losers. If you go to winners or losers, often you're kind of too far along in a church conflict. And then simply having everyone to have their say doesn't necessarily help without a framework for this conversation. Don't rush too quickly towards a majority vote. Even after a vote, anxiety still circulates in the system, she says. So what holds the church together, then, for Fuller is not sameness, but vulnerable differences. So we can see that what happens in relationships in congregations are often kind of cross-cutting identities, so people might belong to different identity subgroups at the same time. And people need to learn to define themselves in a variety of ways, and not just in the relationship to the main conflict that might be existing in the congregation. And Fuller really takes seriously this natural human tendency to meet in like-minded groups. What's really important is the presence of calm, connected leaders, which leads to some of Fuller's more recent work on self-care for the pastor, on the importance of self-care. So as non-anxious as possible, you've heard the phrase non-anxious presence, as non-anxious as possible in the midst of conflict. But also while you try to stay in touch with all the parts of the congregation. So family systems theorists have noted that leaders sometimes just focus on the people who are like them and listen to those people. Try instead to break up those groups and listen to a variety of people in a community in conflict. So what's going to happen in conflict is people are scapegoating conflict onto a few individuals. And what you do in leadership then is you don't abdicate your position, but you stay in contact with all sides. So she mentions how, according to Mary McClintock Fulkerson, wounds generate new thinking. So in conflict, how could we allow conflict in our communities to create new thinking? So in order to do that, we have to challenge the scapegoating, the idea that the conflict is about a few bad apples. Instead, it's about, this is an important quote from her on page 192, quote, individuals with incompatible needs, wishes, and desires, at the same time part of a diverse creation, end quote, on page 192. So these were some of the really helpful insights that I found from Leanna Fuller's book, When Christ's Body is Broken, Anxiety, Identity, and Conflict in Congregations. Some of the discussion was about church conflicts that are a couple of years old now, and in some ways we've moved into different areas of church conflict, and we're in a more politically polarized season perhaps than we were even when this book was written. There's a little discussion of polity in this book, which I thought was a little bit interesting, but it might have to do with how these particular congregations handled these conflicts. So, and a couple of things I really like about this book, it just really helps give a deep look at what's at stake in church conflict for people who are anxious in a kind of fundamental self way. So they're anxious that something of their self will be taken away. And this, I think, helps explain conflict in congregations better than some of the books about antagonists in church or clergy killers. Some of those terms that are a little bit psychologically shallow and not very sociologically rich. I was fascinated, so I would recommend something like Fuller's book over a book like Clergy Killers, which tends to isolate and pathologize a particular individual rather than looking from a systems perspective. So I found Fuller's discussion of both psychology, sociology, and then also theology to be really rich for Christian community. And it reminded me that it's very hard to be involved in religious communities for a long time because of the inevitable presence of conflict. And it also explains why church conflict is at the heart of what it means to be a church. So that the activity of churches being in conflict is itself a theological act that reflects on who God is and also helps us understand who we are to be in the future. It reminded me of a few great kind of supervision moments I've had in ministry around church conflict, where outside people have come in and helped adjudicate different claims that were being made between different groups. And it just also helped remind me that there's a lot of communication that's not the answer. So just talking it out is not necessarily the answer. And some of the ways in which church conflict can be handled in an undisciplined fashion can actually lead to more polarization, more breaking up of community, more us or them thinking. And so if it's going in that direction, this is a plea both to understand the rich pastoral complexity of the activity that's happening, but also to get professional help at that point as well. I hope that you've enjoyed this video, these set of videos on Fuller's work, and just know that this is a tremendous pastoral resource for your thinking about the very common activity of churches and then denominations in conflict as well. Thank you so much.